Extraordinary rendition is not something the British government ever wanted to admit being involved in, nor are acts of torture and human rights abuses. The Prime Minister gave assurances that work in Afghanistan is mission accomplished, a sentiment echoed by the Home Secretary when she met with the Home Affairs Select Committee on Monday. But the war on terror has not been a clean fight, and allegations of illegal activity by the government and intelligence agencies have been rife. The Justice and Security Act means court procedures can be held in secret, which is just another blow for civil liberties. And with intrusive spying and data mining done in the name of security, former intelligence officers are increasingly concerned as to whom we all need protection from. With me is Annie Machon, a whistleblower and a former intelligence officer at MI5. Annie, welcome to Going Underground. Was the British intelligence agencies, were they complicit with rendition from the start?
Well, from all the available evidence, absolutely. As soon as the intelligence gloves came off, as the CIA said after 9/11, they've been helping out their cousins as much as they can. We have a situation we know now that Sir Richard Dearlove, then the head of MI6, and Dame Eliza Manningham Buller, then the head of MI5, were flown into the States even while there was an air blockade in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to plan their response. So I think even at that point, at a very high level, they had agreed to help. Effectively, they're American overlords now. I mean, they're very much the junior partners in this relationship.
In the run-up to the Iraq War, the politicians were very careful to say no at the time, that they were breaking any huge conventions, and so is the Prime Minister now. They're adamant that no.
Well, unfortunately, history seems to have shown that they've lied, is the best way of putting it. Sir Richard Dearlove was instrumental in drawing up the fake intelligence that took our countries into the illegal war in Iraq in 2003.
Didn't they say, oh, the politicians were pressuring us, we were against it? That's why some of their elite corps have leaked things to the press or even come out.
They would say that, wouldn't they? Unfortunately, it now appears that Sir Richard Dearlove, whatever his personal reservations, was very keen to have a seat at that top table and was passing on unsubstantiated and unverified raw information from unknown sources as well, straight to his political masters in the UK and straight to the political masters of the US. So he was instrumental in providing the raison d'etre for that war. We also know as well that he did have private reservations because in 2004, I think it was, there was the infamous leaked Downing Street memo, which was draft minutes of a sofa-based conversation with him and Alistair Campbell and the Prime Minister Tony Blair at the time. And even he is marked in those draft minutes, C, the head of MI6, saying that the policy was being, the facts of the case were being fixed around a preconceived policy to go to war.
And he was worried about that. He obviously wanted to have that in black and white in that memo.
Yes, whether or not they actually made it into the final minutes is another matter. But yes, so he said that at that time, but that didn't seem to stop MI6 mainlining this raw information, unverified information, which was used not only by Tony Blair to justify the war in the debate in Parliament on the eve of war, but also by Colin Powell at the UN. And the information he used there was the fact that Iraq was trying to acquire uranium from Niger. And this was based on fake documents that MI6 had acquired from Italy. And without verifying them, they'd fed these fake documents into the UN process.
As we know about the Valerie Plame thing. But staying with the rendition, so Binyam Mohammed, Mohsen Beg, Bishar el-Rawi, all saying that they either saw or knew that there were British intelligence officers during their torture at Guantanamo.
Well, not just Guantanamo. I mean, Binyam Mohammed is probably one of the most egregious cases because he was kidnapped and taken to Morocco. And it was there that, I mean, stress positions and all that are terrible enough and are indeed torture. But his information, his evidence was that he was strung up and he had his genitals repeatedly cut with a razor over a period of time. And during that time, he heard British accents, British voices from British intelligence officers feeding questions into that process.
And this was quite some time ago, so why no prosecutions, why no further evidence or action by the Crown Prosecution Service or anyone else in government?
That is a very good question. Well, there has been some civil cases, of course, which MI5, MI6 settled out of court because they didn't want the evidence to come out in open court. And now, of course, what we're looking at is, in response to that, there has indeed been action but not to hold the spies to account for torturing British people, rather to ensure that if they are caught out again in the future, any case will be heard in secret. And this was one of the outcomes of the Criminal Justice Act that was passed this year, which basically said for the first time British justice can be hidden entirely secretly in courts for these sort of civil actions. And I think this is put in place with another very notorious rendition allegation around Abdel Hakim Belhaj, who was the Libyan resistance fighter who was kidnapped.
Jihadist.
Yes, kidnapped from the Far East with his heavily pregnant wife, taped to the floor of a plane for hours at a time, including his wife, and taken back, extraordinarily rendered, kidnapped, back to Libya, and handed as a gift to Colonel Gaddafi, who was still at that time in power. I think it was 2004. And the evidence has come out since Gaddafi's fall. Papers have emerged from the former head of the Libyan
intelligence. They left them lying around in
one
Libya
has to
on
wonder
the ground.
if that was just carelessness or if that was a sort of insurance policy left by the very wily head of intelligence, Moussa Koussa, before he fled to the UK and then fled to Qatar. Who knows? But the point is, this stuff has now come out. It says very clearly that a very senior MI6 officer was saying, here, Gaddafi, we want to cement our new deal in the desert, our relationship.
That case is going on at
the
moment, though, isn't it?
Well, we don't know, because now the secret courts have been brought into being, and they were rushed in to ensure that the Belhaj case was held in secret. It may already have happened. I mean, this goes against almost 1,000 years of evolution of British justice, which was supposed to be seen to be done in public with a jury of your peers.
The defenders of British secret courts would say that at least now the cases are being heard, whereas when they rendered people during the days in Ireland and so forth, the cases wouldn't even be heard at all by a judge. At least now they're being heard, albeit in secret.
Well, one thing, they are sort of partially being heard, but only the representatives, only the government, the prosecution, is allowed to pick the lawyers they want to use. The person who's bringing the complaint, some say Belhaj or someone like that, is not allowed to appoint the lawyer they want, who might be, you know, a very famous civil liberties lawyer like Gareth Peirce or something. So they are only allowed a specially appointed government lawyer who has been vetted, who can't speak to their client, who can only try and intervene in the, you know, in any way they can, and then they can't feed back to the client. This is incredibly one-sided justice as well as being incredibly secret justice. So it does mirror the Diplock courts from the bad old days in Northern Ireland. There's no doubt about it, because the laws are all in place. Sure, they're only being used against a small minority, small groups within the UK or across the world at the moment. But the law, of course, applies to everybody. Now, one of the dangers is if they move the goalposts of those laws, they change the laws in future. For example, you might be out there waving a placard on the street, you might be part of an Occupy group or something like that, and you could, in the future, be deemed to be a domestic extremist or even a terrorist. And as soon as, of course, you're deemed to be that, you lose all your civil liberties and can be snatched and taken abroad or thrown into a secret court. And it's not just these civil cases. There were arguments around whether or not 2 terrorist suspects should be tried in a criminal court in the Old Bailey in a secrecy. So, of course, there's already mission creep from what started out as just civil cases against the UK spies to major criminal cases being held in secret. And this was all obviously, people warned about this as these laws were passing. There was a lot of concern. Even the lawyers vetted by the government to act as the special representatives in these secret courts banded together and told the government they disagreed with it, and yet it's still being forced through.
Well, let's get back to British state torture. The Prime Minister said that he did want an inquiry into the allegations of UK complicity. Cameron was pretty fierce, wasn't he, in his criticism at the time, or at least saying there has to be some inquiry into this.
Well, I don't think it's a case of which political party is in power. The government just rolls on and will do what it wants, and the spies have massive leverage over the governments. It's a bit like saying, oh, the bad old days of George W. Bush's presidency. Obama comes in and he'll get rid of all these terrible things that Bush has put in place, like Guantanamo Bay. And in fact, Obama is far worse. Now he has presidentially signed kill lists that the CIA present to him based on flimsy evidence, flimsy intelligence.
See, Britain doesn't have them yet.
Well, Britain is probably feeding information in about supposed jihadist suspects, no doubt about that, because the relationship between the US and the UK spies is incredibly close. A bit like with this notional parliamentary oversight, which is the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is not a parliamentary committee. It's appointed by the PM. It reports to the PM, and the PM can vet its findings if he doesn't like them. So all this is done very much in secret.
So the British secret services at the time, certainly during the run-up to Iraq, I certainly know of major broadcasting figures that would meet with them, and the security services would be telling them, it's terrible, we're coming under intolerable pressure from the government, from politicians, to mess around with the intelligence. You seem to be suggesting the intelligence services are overruling politicians.
Well, the politicians have to take on trust what the intelligence agencies tell them. And the politicians keep coming out and saying, we know what they're doing because we have to sign this and we have to sign that, and they brief me every week. But actually, I know from the inside how easy it is for the spies to lie to their notional political masters. And they do, and they get away with it because there is no way of their knowing they've been lied to.
Presumably the present heads of the Secret Services would say it's changed since those days.
It has changed, I would agree. I think it's got worse.
How do we know?
By reading between the lines. The fact that they can have secret courts, the fact that they have culturally shifted from the 1990s where they did not use torture to now being complicit in it. And the reason in the 1990s they didn't use torture was vaguely ethical, but actually it was based on experience from the civil war in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s when they had done. And they realised it was counterproductive. It created blowback, it created a whole new generation of very angry people who potentially could become terrorists. That is what we're seeing again across the Middle East and Central Asia. So it was a pragmatic decision, it was an ethical decision, and it's been overturned since 9/11.
So why the return now to this need to use fear?
Because people who are fearful are very easy to persuade to give up their hard-won civil liberties. And we in the West have spent 500 years building up this canon of fundamental rights for human beings. Not to be extrajudicially murdered, not to be tortured, not to be disappeared into a prison, to have the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. All these things have taken centuries to build up. But by creating fear of the unknown nebulous terrorist, then suddenly people are happy to trade their liberties for security, which of course is not working out. And one of the fundamental basic human rights is privacy, because if you lose that, you lose all the others of freedom to ingest information, to communicate information, to plan, to think, everything. And that's why this privacy issue is so fundamentally important.
Annie Mashore, thank you for going underground.